Hey, greetings everyone. Welcome back. This is another edition of ChiroSecure's Let's Get Your Office Practicing Better, Doing Better, Making More Money. That's what we do with my service, the H.J. Ross Network, is to make sure your office is compliant. Compliance always equals money. What we're going to focus in on this program is going to be chiropractic documentation, something we all hate to talk about, but it's something we have to have. And you wonder, well, why do I have to have it? I'm an all cash office. I don't need to document, or at least not as much, or if only if I'm billing insurance or Medicare. And that, frankly, is not necessarily the case. There's documentation requirements regardless of how you're being reimbursed for your services. So let's dig into that. Let's talk about chiropractic documentation. Let's go to the slides. For chiropractic documentation, I want you to think of it this way. I want you to assure whatever you've done with the patient, whatever you billed them for, is within the notes. And this is where we often run into problems. We have to make sure that everything that was done appears in the notes. And you've probably heard this statement before. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. And that's very, very true. If it's not written down, it didn't occur. So we got to think if we have to have things written down or documented. I won't say you have to handwrite it anymore. Most people are using electronic records. But do the services that we billed for, do the services that we assure the patient had, are they in the file? And so what we do is we have to look here. Oh, I lost my, here, there we go. Who tells us we have to do this? This is one of the things I think often people get frustrated and they think, well, no, I don't, because I don't bill insurance. Well, who says you have to do it and the why? Board of Chiropractic. The board has standards that the services that are being provided must be documented adequately within the file, whether it's going to be exam, diagnosis, the treatment you provided. It doesn't matter whether or not it's being billed to insurance. The board requires it. Well, who also requires it? In fact, I'm losing my spot here. There's going to be, of course, state and federal regulations that are going to require it as well. That's going to certainly fit. What do you mean by the state? Well, that's the board. The federal is going to be under the federal government, if you will, under standards of HIPAA, if nothing else. But realize there's city and county rules that may apply, as well as just community standards. And this does involve insurance, if you will, but also your peers, but more importantly, the patient. What if the patient comes back and says, this doctor did not perform these services, or I felt he charged me too much? How do you defend that the services you were done? It's what you've documented. So again, I want to get away from the whole insurance thing. I don't care. I want to make sure everything that we've done is in the file. What if the patient makes a complaint that something improper happened in the visit? Here's a good example. What about a patient that complains, I felt dizzy after the visit? What did you document at the end? One of the things you should be in the habit of is when you're finished with the visit, asking the patient how they feel and how they felt at the end of the visit. Because if you don't indicate it, that means the patient will say, well, I didn't feel anything, or I felt horrible. I want to know that, to document that, to make sure that if anyone comes back later and says, this patient felt dizzy, you're going to highlight, no, they did not. In fact, at the end of the visit, we inquire with the patient and document it. Now, it's not to say maybe they didn't feel it sometime later, but they cannot say it was felt there, and we documented that information. Well, you may wonder, what does the state board say? This is the Board of Chiropractic Examiners for California. And I want you to realize, I'm using California just as an example. I don't care what state you're in. You're going to find a lot of the same things here. You'll see things that talks about doing insurance fraud, unlicensed practice, sexual misconduct, all those bad things. I want to focus on really kind of the first thing. It says here, insurance fraud. Now, forget insurance. Billing for a service not rendered. Now, you may say, well, of course, Sam, I rendered the service, I charged the patient. Not if you didn't document it. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. So always think of, there's a requirement to document the services to make sure that if someone comes back and questions what was performed that day, whether it's going to be just a question of the patient or something where they're making a complaint, we're going to have information there. Here's one you can see. This is an insurance one. And of course, everyone thinks, well, I don't bill insurance. But look at what it says here. I think it's interesting. The objective of this audit was to see whether or not the doctor's records indicated what was done. It says here for 11 members dated for about a year, it says upon review, it was found that 96% of the services were coded and paid inappropriately, while 3% were paid appropriately. So in other words, 97% error rate? What happened here that we didn't have it? Well, here's what it says. It says it recommends improvement in documentation compliance, modality not identified, partially or fully cloned medical records. This is where you have to be careful. Electronic health records, of course, is what you should be using, but be careful of certain aspects of just cloning information over and over. Says the same thing. If you were telling me I did ultrasound to the right patellar tendon for 8 minutes and that were cloned, I'd say, yeah, that sounds reasonable. Now, obviously, will that change a little bit day to day? Is it always going to be exactly 8 minutes? Maybe not. But nonetheless, there could be certain aspects, but please be careful. Don't clone subjective and objective data over and over. It doesn't make sense. That's not how a patient talks. By the way, does your patient actually ever say, I felt pain 51 to 74% of the time? Who in the world says that? Give me information what the patient really says here. And it says service billed, not rendered. Well, I don't think the service probably wasn't rendered, but it wasn't documented, or no documentation is received. So these are the types of things I deal with all the time. I deal with a lot of issues, whether it's going to be board or insurance, where doctors get themselves in a little bit of trouble. Remember, ChiroSecure protects you in audits. But one of the best things to do is protect you before it happens, so that making sure if someone looks at your records, no big deal. Everything is there. Well, I'm part of the United Healthcare Optum Health Coding and Reimbursement Committee. And one of the things I do within this committee, by the way, I'm not paid by them, I'm an appointed member. These are the things for chiropractic claims that they show that we have failure rates. Now, you'll notice illegible documentation went away in 2015, or at least a large amount of it, probably because we're using electronic records. But you'll notice service not documented, 6%. That's not too bad, but that's still higher than I'd like to see. But you'll notice the biggest issue that we have is there's no timed services that are documented properly, 22%. So that's a pretty large amount. So we want to make sure what things are we making sure are documented is time. Time documentation for chiropractic, particularly for time services, is a big issue. Think in yourself, did you actually document time? Did you tell me how many minutes? Or did you tell me from and to? I don't care which, by the way, just do that. That's not hard, not at all. In fact, I'm showing this for chiropractic, but take a look here. Everyone says, oh, chiropractic documentation is horrible. Well, let's see. Based on their audits, you'll notice who has the highest level? Not chiros, but PTs, 38% of the time. Chiros are at 20%. Now, I'm not proud of that. That means 3/4 of the time we're not doing a good job of making sure we've adequately documented the services provided. So let's fix that a little bit. Here's what part of the problem is. You'll see here it says, out of the 22 patients reviewed, 22 lack supporting documentation that validated the services billed. So what does this mean? Well, here it shows documentation to support the medical necessity of manual therapy for spinal regions was not there. We need to have very specific things. Notice it says, description of the manual therapy technique, which may include one or more of the common manual therapy techniques. Realize, trigger point therapy, manual traction, any of that's fine, but you have to say it. Don't say I did manual therapy, too broad. What type of manual therapy? Where did you do it and how much time? And I see this time and time again. So let's start with the first place we often run into problems. Exams. When you do your evaluation and management, you're familiar with these codes, new patient, established patient, but let's talk about what level of code am I appropriately billing? So by example, if I'm billing a 99202 or a 99203, how am I choosing that code? Well, let's go back. You'll look at each of these codes. A 202 says 15 to 29 minutes. A 203 says 30 to 44. So one of the aspects could be how much time is spent. And actually, you can use time. Realize, what are we documenting? The time we spend on exam should be documented if you are using time as the value. Let's face it, sometimes you can have a patient that doesn't have a very severe problem, but because of their past history, complicating factors, use of pharmacology or use of drugs or prescriptions, that exam, meaning history, may take an extended amount of time. So what if I spend over 30 minutes, but if the problem is relatively simple? Well, it happens because I have to have all that information properly. If it takes over 30 minutes, I'm going to bill a 99203. Now, if it takes, say, from 15 to 29, I'm going to bill a 99202. Now, you may say, well, Sam, what about if I spend less than that? Well, go back here. You'll notice a 202 says 15 to 29. So you might ask yourself, well, what code do I bill if I only spend 10 minutes? And that can happen. Let's face it, some of you can be very efficient. In fact, all of you will be very efficient on how you perform an exam. And the way you performed exams when you first started to now are a big difference. It doesn't take you as long. However, if the problem is of a severe enough level, the medical decision-making may bring it there. So I'll give an example. What if you have a patient with a sprain or some type of trauma, and that exam only takes 10 to 12 minutes? Could that still qualify for a 99203? Absolutely. The reason why is the medical decision-making of that type of complaint or injury lends to a 203. So here's what I'm getting to. What am I documenting? I need you to, in the notes, whenever you have done an exam and you build for that level, have some indication of why. Did I bill this exam because I spent 30 minutes? Or was it because I had medical decision making that fit that type of complaint? Probably one of the easiest ways to see this is just looking at the codes from a time value. Here you'll see the 15 minutes, 29, and so on. But you'll notice the medical decision making, and this is often confusing. People wonder, well, what do you mean by medical decision making? Now, I'm kind of making this a little bit simplistic, but it still fits. If a patient has one simple complaint, even if you spend 5 minutes on the evaluation, on the initial, would that still qualify for an E&M? You bet it does. It would be a 202. Notice, one self-limited or minor problem. Now, here's where a lot of people miss the boat. You know what a 203 equals? When someone has 2 or more complaints. How many patients come in your office with 2 complaints? I mean, several will come, oh, doc, my neck is hurting. But how many come in, oh, man, my neck, it's going in my shoulder. I'm feeling a bit in my mid and low back. Well, that's 2 or more complaints. That automatically makes it a 203. But notice what also does that is an acute injury. So any trauma will jump you up to a 203 because chances are if there's trauma, are you ordering extra tests such as x-rays? So I want to highlight when you're documenting here to make sure that if you're billing a 203, I want you to be the first person to know, I know it's a 203 because I spent 30 minutes or there were 2 complaints or trauma. It is that simple, but you got to make sure it's in the notes. Remember, not documented, didn't happen. How about an acute complicated injury, a pretty significant trauma on a PI case that has radiation down the legs or something? Well, I call that a complicated case. That means that 204 fits that. But what if you don't spend 45 minutes? Well, that's okay because of the injury itself. Not always it's time. Think of it, medical doctors often don't use time at all because they're looking at something that may be severe but can do it within a short amount of time. Chiropractic was always pushed back on that we couldn't bill a higher code, but you can. But we have to make sure that if we're billing a higher code, justify it. It's got to be documented. What is it? Time or medical decision making. Now, 205 probably we don't get for medical decision making threat to life, but you ever had a patient that spent 60 minutes? That happens. I won't say it's typical, but it happens. So here's my point. When you're billing an E&M code, make sure it's separate and distinct from the evaluation associated with treatment. Then, of course, make sure whatever level you're billing, it fits the code, meaning by time or medical decision making. By the way, 202 to 205, these same parameters fit for 212 to 215. The only difference, time is a little shorter. Here's my point. When you've documented an exam, don't make anyone ever say, we don't see a separate exam. Yes, you do. It's separate, distinct, above and beyond what we normally do. And I've indicated time. I'm going to tell you, chances are you should do both. Because sometimes you may think something's going to take a short time. Before you know it, you're like, oh my God, that took much longer. Or sometimes it doesn't. Keep in mind, time doesn't just equal the time with the patient when it comes to these services. The things you do before and after on the same day as an exam can certainly count as well. Now, what's another big area of documentation you have to make sure you're compliant? Of course, our adjustment. It's the thing you do. Now, your chiropractic manipulation should be documented. Where did you manipulate? Of course. But remember, the code you are using has to match not based on your style of adjustment, but on the regions you're manipulating and the diagnosis. So by example, if you're doing a Gonstead, or maybe Gonstead's a bad example, maybe you're doing a diversified or activator style, you might adjust multiple areas of the spine to aid in correction of a cervical diagnosis. Perfectly fine. However, you cannot bill a 98942 just because you adjust all 5 regions. It's got to be based on diagnosis and the regions manipulated, and they have to meet. So by example, if you do only upper cervical, even though you've diagnosed 5 regions, you still get a 98940 because you're only manipulating 1. So keep in mind, documentation must match. So if you're billing a 98941, did you document a minimum of 3 regions that you have diagnosed and a minimum that you've manipulated them? Now, a quick note on documentation. I'm assuming most of you are familiar. When it comes to Medicare, it does require you indicate specific vertebra. So you must indicate I did C2 and C5, by example. For other insurances, you don't have to be that specific. You have to indicate the region. However, I will warn you, I'm not sure you're aware. Do you know Anthem? And I'm talking all Anthem. I don't care what state you're in. Anthem requires you indicate not only the region, but your technique. So to make it easy, you know what I would think to do? How about we just get in the habit to make sure that we always put in vertebra and technique. That way we satisfy the fullest amount. Now, if you say, Sam, it's not a Medicare claim, I don't worry about it, and you give me region, I'll say that's okay. But make sure it's documented. Now let's talk about, hey, forget insurance, Sam. What about a patient that says, I didn't receive an adjustment today? And your chart notes don't make any clear indication of where you manipulated, the type of manipulation. Please be specific so that way there's never a question about what you do. And remember, keep therapies simple, but documented. Make sure, in fact, here's my golden rule. If you can read a chart note and based on that chart note could perform the service, I would say the documentation is adequate. By example, if I said I did infrared heat, would that be adequate? Well, if I told my staff to do infrared heat, what would be the question they ask? Where, doc? So when you document, you need to make sure specifically the what and the where. So here's some examples. If I'm going to do mechanical traction, let's say, indicate where you're doing the traction, what type. Are you doing it with the harness? What's the weight? In other words, make it so that when someone reads it, they can perform it. Notice infrared heat to the lumbar spine, E-stim to the traps, 4 pads at what intensity, or ultrasound. We can't just say knee. What part of the knee? The knee's a big structure. Do you mean popliteal fossa, lateral side, medial side, whatever the case may be? Indicate it and keep it simple. Golden rule. Be able to read it and perform it. What if I'm doing an exercise therapy? What if I said, I did exercise for 20 minutes? Okay. What exercise did you do? Oh, we did curl-ups, 5 times 25. We did Supermans, 4 times 20. We did bird dogs, 3 times 20, and it took us 22 minutes. That would be the documentation. Don't create and make yourself upset like I have to write so much. Actually, you don't. Just make sure that when you go back to read it, you can exactly see what you did and how you did it. If you've done that, you're safe. Realize don't overcomplicate it, but also make sure that you have the simplest things there. In fact, always think Occam's razor. The answer is almost always the simplest. Can I read the note and see what's performed? Don't be caught with this. This is one of the things I deal with continuously. ChiroSecure, of course, covers you for audits. If someone audits your file, they're going to protect you. They're going to fight back. You know who they're going to use? Me. They're going to bring it to me. Hey, Sam, let's look at this. Can we defend it? Sometimes I can say, oh my God, this insurance is off their rocker, whomever's requesting it. It could be a state board. It could be a patient. Or sometimes I'll say, uh-oh. Let's not make yourself the uh-oh. Look at your notes critically and see whether or not they're there. That's what I do with the network service. If you're a member, guess what you have to do? Send me samples of your notes yearly so I can verify whether or not you're compliant. I want to correct it beforehand because if we're doing something that's not quite good, we can fix it. And that's really what we're looking for. That compliance saves you every single time. So keep in mind, that's what we do. ChiroSecure is there to help. So is HJ Ross. Go to our website. Take a look. You want to have expert help day to day, a place to always go to learn how to make sure claims get paid, how to make more money, whether it's prepaid plans or otherwise. Come and see me. Thank you, everyone. See you next time.